So Nikon recently gave me their latest release, the Nikon Z5 II, and we're going to test out some of its key features and see how special this camera really is. So the Nikon Z5 II, as the name implies, is an upgrade from the Nikon Z5 I, but honestly, it's not worth the comparison. Like they are just drastically different cameras. This is really a significant upgrade. I'd probably compare this camera more to a ZF and a Z6 III combined, or maybe a ZF and a Z9 or Z8 combined. Really, that's the sort of what you're working with here. This camera is honestly a great first camera if you're looking to get into Nikon cameras. And also it's just a perfect all-rounder camera from Nikon as well. Doesn't do anything like crazy or gimmicky, but it just has everything that you would need for a good all-round camera. Like I just kept finding things and I was just like, oh, it's got that, it's got that, it's got that. It's covering all of its grounds here. And that's what I really like about this camera. So first off, let's talk about the image quality. Now the sensor we're working with here is a 24.2 megapixel back illuminated full frame sensor. Love me a full frame sensor, have to crop to different aspect ratios all the time, so that's going to be useful to me. But I think the key thing here is what we're working with here is a back illuminated sensor. Now, back illuminated basically means that this camera is going to work like an absolute beast in low light. And really, that's the truth. Like I've worked with a lot of different cameras. I typically work with some Sonys and Canons, and usually I work around maybe at most 1200 ISO, maybe 2000 ISO if I really want to push it. But after that, I start worrying about noise and grain. I was shooting with this camera at like 6400 ISO and the images still look great. Like I still had good exposure. I mean, I'm just not used to doing street photography primarily because of that exposure reason. But honestly, this would be a camera that would get me into street photography because it just works so incredibly well in the low light situations. And the same I could say for video. Like I might be in a situation where it's, crap lighting, maybe some fairy lights, some weak street lights, and this camera is still giving me great exposure. Maybe not hitting over like 500 IRE, but it's still giving me enough that, you can sort of see what you're working with. Really, it's a great camera, and if you do want to sort of go full on nocturnal and shoot in the dark, you can, but then at that point, obviously, you're going to be seeing noise. But really, the low light capabilities of this camera are really impressive, and I'm glad that Nikon keeps doing this. So in terms of the video frame rates that you're working with here, you have 4K at 60p for H.265, as well as 120p at Full HD for H.265 as well. But you also have 4K at 30p, 24p, and 25p and RAW. And NRAW is basically Nikon's, equivalent of RAW. It's their own sort of RAW look. But what's special about the NRAW with the Nikon cameras is they've acquired RED cameras. And RED cameras are the cine quality cameras. These are the big movie cameras people like. Amazing color quality, amazing quality. You'd probably have to sell your firstborn if you wanted to buy a whole kit for a RED camera. But recently Nikon acquired them, so that means they have access to all their sort of color profiles and details. And what Nikon has done is they have actually designed red LUTs. So these are color templates that you can actually throw over NRAW footage to give your cameras that red sort of cine coloring. So that's an interesting thing. If you sort of want to get a smaller, cheaper camera and sort of almost have that sort of red sort of coloring close to it, you can do it with this camera. You just got to go to the Nikon website and download those red LUTs to give you that cine look. Now, in terms of the actual color accuracy on this camera in general, I did do a quick skin tone check and it was fairly on point. The skin tones are a little bit pinker, so maybe this is going to be a little bit more saturated than maybe a Canon or something, but otherwise it is a fairly reliable sort of color space that you're working with here. The camera also does have pre-release capture. It's got a mechanical capture at 15 frames per second and electronic capture at 30 frames per second. So only sort of con to the 30 frames per second is because it is electronic shutter, there is going to be a bit more of a global sort of shutter distortion working in there. So the difference is if you're shooting mechanical shutter, fins won't warp as much, but if you're shooting electronic shutter, if it's moving fast enough, there is going to be significant warping, unfortunately. So the in-body stabilization inside this camera is 7.5 stops, which if you know anything about stabilization, is a pretty bloody good number to have inside a camera this size. So that's going to work great for you, a lot of your photography and your videography, but mainly photography. But another thing I also like is this camera does have a VR focus point option. So what that does is if you sort of tap the screen to a particular focus point, like maybe the upper left corner, the focus point will basically optimize the stabilization to ensure that the stabilization happens around that particular focus point. So the stabilization doesn't always have to necessarily happen directly in the center. If you need it optimized more to the corners, you can do that. Although it does seem to flick a bit down to maybe 6 stops if you move to the very far corners for that VR focus point. But otherwise, this is going to be great for a lot of you photographers who want to sort of, optimize that VR stabilization. Now let's talk about the autofocus. So the autofocus here is a very broad types of subject to detect. You of course got people, animals, cars, planes, and bikes. So you can switch out to different subjects. You can also, of course, go to auto to sort of just have a general sort of pick of all of them. And really the autofocus is very damn reliable in this camera. I found it fairly persistent. If you do interrupt it, you can sort of pull it away, but then maybe half a second later, the autofocus does sort of latch back on. In comparison to some other cameras, it might be a tiny bit of delay in terms of how quickly it latches back onto its primary focus point, but really it's not a huge big deal. The autofocus here is very reliable, and what I'm impressed about the autofocus here is it will actually still lock onto your subject even if they're moving into the dark. So if you have a subject that locks into light and they move into the shadows, the autofocus still locks onto them. That's really good to be having here, especially because this is a low light sort of camera, or that's its strength at least. So having the autofocus still working, even if your subject moves into shadows, is a big deal, and I'm impressed by that. And again, if you're sort of dropping in and out of shot as well, the autofocus will still lock onto you. This includes when you're in the light or in the dark as well. It's just, it's just a smart sort of autofocus, relatively quick. Again, if you interrupt it, there is going to be maybe a slight bit of hiccup where it tries to reattach, but that's maybe half a second at most. And this camera also does have a demo autofocus inside that. So that's basically where you hold an object up and the autofocus will pull to that object. I'm waiting for a firmware update because I think that's a cool feature to have. I love it in cameras, but unfortunately here, it does seem to be a bit odd in the way it sort of works. It does sort of take away, it's very finicky in how the demo autofocus works. So hopefully with a few more firmware updates to get that right, because it is a cool feature. On the top here, you also do have a picture profile button. So basically you can sort of scroll through various different types of colored profiles, which you can customize as well for very particular looks. I'm not huge on picture profiles. I'm all about sort of the post-production, but some people like to actually do this stuff inside their camera and just get it then and there. So, no worries there. Now, in terms of the build and design, what we're working with here is a 700-gram camera. And when I first picked it up, I was like, whoa, that feels a little bit heavy. Solid metal and plastic, a very well protected camera. Again, I could probably kill someone with this if I bashed it over their head, but it's a pretty damn good camera overall. And 700 grams, I'm carrying it around. Honestly, I don't really notice the weight difference. Again, it's maybe 25 grams heavier than the Z5-1. Don't quote me on that. But again, I remember it wasn't a significant difference. But really, it's not an uncomfortable camera to be working with. In general, the navigation on this camera is actually really comfortable. I can sort of navigate easily enough. One thing I'm not too crazy about is the ISO. The ISO isn't on its own sort of dial. I usually like having my aperture, ISO, and shutter speed on 3 separate dials to navigate. With this camera here, I do kind of have to hold an ISO button down and then switch between shutter and ISO on this one single dial. So that's always a bit annoying. I'm not a sort of fan of that, but that's what they're working with here on this camera. And you know what? While I'm bitching about this camera, it does use a micro HDMI port, and I fucking hate using micro HDMI ports. I mean, I get it, business choice, they're cheaper, you gotta use them, but just come on, everyone, camera community, guys making the cameras, just use the full HDMIs. You'll feel good. You'll feel good if you use a full HDMI. Stop using the micro HDMIs. Nobody likes them. They always break. I just broke one recently, and now I've got to get that replaced as well. So that's fun. But outside that, great camera. Now what you're working with here is a vari-angle flip screen, and I know that's probably going to break a few people's hearts. I know some people do prefer, having yourself a tilt screen. Or recently there was another camera that had a tilt and vari-angle combination. I don't know why you just do that. Probably money, but I would love to have that. But unfortunately, yeah, you are working with a tilt screen here. And one other little problem with this tilt screen is I can't actually see the previews when I'm doing selfie. So I'll be doing a selfie mode and I maybe want to press the button behind here, see my previews, and I just can't get them set up. So that's unfortunate that that's there, but just got to live with it. But one good thing about this screen, I will say, is that when you're in photo mode, if you rotate the camera to a vertical orientation, the whole layout actually rotates to a vertical orientation as well. So that's pretty damn cool that they're considering, a lot of vertical content creators, or maybe just portrait photographers who like to shoot like that. So good to have that as well. The camera can also be charged by USB-C. You can also sort of shoot it while it's powering directly into the USB-C port as well. So if you hate camera batteries like me, you got that power backup as well. So you could be shooting with this baby all night and all day. In terms of SD cards, you are actually working with two SD card ports here. So you can have maybe your video going to one SD card and your photos going to another SD card. Nice to have that little bit of separation on here, or even just to have a general backup SD card inside the camera. So yeah, that's my first look at the Nikon Z5 II. Might seem like I was crapping it on a bit, but that's just because I'm sick and a bit miserable. But honestly, this is a great all-round camera. When I first picked it up, I was finding all these features. It was great. You've got internal RAW 12-bit, two SD card ports, you have 7.5 stop stabilization, 30 frames capture. I mean, really good autofocus in low light, and just generally really good performance in low light as well. So this is a great camera. The only thing that really fucking sucks about it, again, is that micro HDMI port. They keep putting them in cameras, and I just don't. But in terms of pricing, this camera is like roughly over $2,000. So it's not like an entry level sort of pricing, but it's not a crazy expensive sort of camera. But really, you're getting a good value for money in this camera here. It is a great sort of camera. If you're looking to sort of get into Nikon cameras, I recommend just getting this camera, to be honest. Like, this is a great first camera for anyone that wants to get into Nikon cameras. Also, it's a great all-rounder, as I've already said about this camera, especially if you're a general Nikon shooter. This camera just sort of covers all of its bases just so well. It's just so well. Again, there's nothing like crazy gimmicky or weirdly specific that it's good at, but it just does a solid job. Like its design, it's just a solid camera. But let me know what you think of the Z5 II. What are you excited about? Do you think this compares at all to the Z5 I? Personally, I don't think it does, but let me know in the comments below.